In March, the East Coast Music Association revoked this Cape Breton guitarist's nomination for Indigenous Artist of the Year, saying the law has not recognized Maxime Cormier or the community he's a member of, the Highland Metis, as members of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada under the Constitution.
I dug them yesterday, so...
The controversy reignited debate about the growing number of self-identified Métis in Eastern Canada and what their claims of indigeneity mean for Métis and Mi'kmaq rights and sovereignty.
So we're talking about a social phenomenon here, a social movement. There's something happening.
St. Mary's University professor Daryl Leroux has been researching those in Quebec and the Maritimes who self-identify as Métis.
And what I'm arguing is that the large majority of people who are claiming to be Indigenous aren't Indigenous.
According to Statistics Canada, in 1996, 860 people in Nova Scotia self-identified as Métis. By 2016, that number jumped to more than 23,000. That's 27 times more people in the province who say they're Métis. Leroux calls the phenomenon white settler revisionism.
Not only turning Acadians or French descendants, this happens in Quebec, like I said, it happens in Vermont and New Hampshire, into Indigenous people on the basis of one, perhaps two Indigenous ancestors in the 1600s, but also reconstructing French ancestors as Indigenous for the purpose of becoming Indigenous today.
Leroux traces some of his own roots to Mohawk and Algonquin ancestors, but says that doesn't make him Indigenous.
My family hunts and fishes. We have these stories, these family stories about having long ago Indigenous ancestors, which may come from genealogists who had been in the family, but my family has no relationship with living Indigenous people.
He says claims of Eastern Métis identity are detrimental to Indigenous people who are fighting to preserve their culture, rights, sovereignty, and very existence.
Between 50 and 75% of French descendants have one of, or at least one of, the handful of Indigenous women to marry Frenchmen before 1670 as an ancestor. So first of all, if everybody who had one of those women as an ancestor claimed to be Indigenous today, we're talking in the order of 10 million people.
Leroux figures about 200,000 people in Eastern Canada presently self-identify as Métis. But who are the roughly 25,000 in Nova Scotia? Daphne Williamson is a Halifax lawyer and member of the Southwest Nova Métis Council. She says she's speaking on behalf of 7 out of 8 Métis leaders in Nova Scotia.
We kept our ways, we kept our stories, we kept our beliefs, we kept our knowledge of each other and our way of life within our communities.
Williamson says the Métis of Nova Scotia faced discrimination because of their biracialism, but endured oppression and stigma and developed their own identities and cultures over hundreds of years.
Each community is distinct in and of itself because of the way that it historically evolved. The circumstances, the mix of ethnicities that were comprised at the time.
Williamson, whose mother is from Cape Sable Island in southwestern Nova Scotia, found out later in life that she has Indigenous ancestors, the Wampanoag, from Massachusetts.
My first thing was to understand what that means. What does it mean to be an Aboriginal person? The European view to me is very self-centered and exploitative and divide and conquer, and that's just not the way that I've ever been and the way that most people in my community have ever been.
Jennifer Adeze, an Indigenous Studies professor at Carleton University who is Métis, says a Métis person is more than someone of mixed ancestry, and that the real Métis nation developed in the Red River Valley in Manitoba.
When we say that Métis were born on the prairies, it's because we're also recognizing the rootedness of First Nations women in those areas that give rise to a distinct Métis language called Metis and a distinct Métis culture that connects us to the lands we come from.
Williamson disagrees.
The key is its self-identification. It is the right of self-identification that is constitutionally protected. So it's up to the individual how they want to define themselves and their community of membership.
The Bredor Lake Métis are based here in Cape Breton. According to their website, they were the first Métis in Canada, said to be born in Nova Scotia around 1628. We contacted Bredor Lake leader Shane Savory to ask about his community's history.
Chris Bookow's report says it all for all of us.
He declined to go on camera.
You choose to get back to me in a few months. Thank you.
Okay, our story is going to run... Hello? The report Savory claims says it all was written by Christian Boudreau about the Métis in southwest Nova Scotia. Boudreau says in the early 1600s, Europeans intermarried with the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet, creating a distinct mixed heritage people who endured prejudice, which continues to the present day. Leroux criticized the paper on Twitter, saying there is no consideration of Mi'kmaq perspectives on the existence of another Indigenous people on Mi'kmaq territory, and that Boudreau and his co-authors provide no evidence the people they're writing about maintained kinship relations and accompanying forms of responsibility with Mi'kmaq people. Leroux accused Boudreau of turning Mi'kmaq people in the past into so-called Métis. APTN reached out to Boudreau to discuss his research, but the author declined an interview.
It doesn't matter what anyone publishes or posts or tweets or recirculates. That in and of itself is not going to justify any claim. It's about actually holding yourself accountable and answering to many of the questions and concerns that people have around these appropriations.
Mi'kmaq lawyer and Professor Pam Palmater rejects the claim that Métis communities have existed in Mi'kmaq territory for hundreds of years.
A Métis person actually has to be connected to a historic Métis community that has continued into present day. And there is, by all research and historical accounts, never been Métis communities in the Maritime provinces, in Mi'kmaq territory, ever. And that's pretty conclusive.
She's not alone.
Little things like that, they all build into one big pot of something that's going to explode.
You don't have a problem with you guys or your hunt.
We're not making a living on this. You do have a problem because you're here.
Coming up in Part 2, members of the Mi'kmaq community speak out about the threats they say self-identified Métis pose to Mi'kmaq rights and sovereignty. Justin Brake, APTN National News, Halifax.